Thank you, Martin. I call the Assembly to order. We continue with some discussion around the two counter motions and the motion as in print. When I call upon Christa Wiegand.
Thank you, moderator. I apologize, I might not be quite eloquent in speaking as many of the others here. I come straight to the point, but
thank you.
Name and number. Christa Wiegand, 711, International Presbytery from Malta. I was quite surprised, if not to say shocked, to hear that we have invested in oil companies. And I have been living in a Northern African country for 16 years, so I have been witnessing some of the practices which are very common in these companies, and such as chemical waste, which is a byproduct in refining and casing, drilling and all that, which is just buried in something which is called Sahara, and they think it's a very big place and nobody really cares. And so this is one of the points, and there's also other countries in Africa, thinking of Nigeria, where they have leakages in oil pipes, which they jeopardize the life of a whole village. Nobody really cares to repair that quickly or something like that. And so I'm really a bit shocked to hear that this is where we are investing, and I do not think that if we withdraw our money, that the oil companies will go bankrupt. But I do think I will have a big problem if I have to if I'm being asked by one of our refugees, a Nigerian, for example, and saying, why is the church I'm going to, or the church you are with, investing in people which they don't care about our living? So I strongly want to support the motion of Jennifer Adams. Thank you.
Claudia Nicholson.
Claudia Nicholson, 636. It's really a question to those who are interested in the investments of what the Church of Scotland is doing.
Do you think you could pull the microphone just slightly nearer you, because you're quite faint?
I'm quite small too, Susan. You can hear me now. And,
thank you.
And in answer to one of the speakers who was saying that there were thousands of job losses in the Aberdeenshire area, that seems to be in spite of the Church of Scotland's investment into the oil industry. The question that I have is it possible to say what percentage of the whole global investments into the oil industry, what is the actual percentage of the Church of Scotland's input? And if we withdrew that, would it really make a significant change in monetary terms? I think if we withdrew, it would be a huge moral impact, and the headlines, I think, would be good. Thank you.
Thank you. Ian MacDonald.
Moderator MacDonald, 677. We speak sometimes, moderator, as though the 11th hour was still some way off, and it's not. We're very much living in it, and have been for some time. The scientific evidence suggests to us that we may already have missed some of the crucial tipping points in this situation, but it also suggests to us that there are others which are still to come and which we can influence positively and effectively as long as we're prepared to act now. Not tomorrow, not next year, not maybe to start thinking about disinvestment a couple of years down the line, but to act now. And the practical evidence which backs up the scientific evidence can be seen all around our globe, particularly in some of the poorest countries of this world, who are affected disproportionately, punitively by global warming, and where some of the poorest people in our world have to deal on a daily basis with the effects of this on their livelihood and on their aspirations. Moderator, if we continue to bury our head in the sand, we will at least have plenty of sand to bury our heads in. With the encroachment of deserts upon otherwise good, arable, farmable land at an alarming rate across this world, we're creating problems for ourselves that are just going to build up more and more into the future. I'm delighted that the climate change deniers have largely been silenced in recent years, but it's taken a long time. It's taken more than a decade before we've reached that situation, and we've a position now where the vast majority of people accept these facts and accept something of the immediacy that we now face. But it would be a tragedy if now that we've reached that situation, we somehow assume that that buys us extra time, because it simply does not. Moderator, the report that we have here is a good one. It's a welcome one. It's one we should all be buying into, I'm sure. But I think it's let down by this particular point in the deliverance. And Jenny Adams' deliverance goes a long way towards filling in that gap and is closer to the actual spirit of the report itself as I see it. And that's because she stresses the urgency of this situation, Moderator. And this is the same kind of urgency that people spoke about here on Monday afternoon with such passion and energy and commitment when we looked at the future of the Kirk itself. If we have that sense of passion and love and urgency for God's church, then surely we should have at least the same sense of passion and urgency and love for God's beautiful earth. Moderator, we're already well into the 11th hour. Let's not sleepwalk past midnight. Thank you.
Isabel Hunter.
Thank you, Moderator. Isabel Hunter, 785. Moderator, I wish to speak against the counter-motion in Jennifer Adams' name and to support that in Albert Bogle's name. I feel that deciding to sell our shares and walk away is an easy way to make us feel good, and it may make us feel even better or more virtuous to realise there will be a significant cost to the church's income, in fact, in doing so. It's certainly a lot easier way in which to get a warm glow than giving up our cars, our plastic goods, or our central heating. But with the best will in the world, we will be reliant on fossil fuels for a lot longer than 2 years. Only this week we've learned of the pollution caused by the increased use of wood-burning stoves in this country. And in much of Africa, wood and dry dung are the only fuels, and the pollution has a terrible effect on people's health. As so often, the picture is grey, not black and white. For example, big oil is also big alternative fuels. They are the companies, as we've been told, with the expertise, the technology, the money, and the self-interest for this research, for they too plan for a future after fossil fuels. Maybe this is not the time to go for what seems an easy win. If we sell our shares now, we will have absolutely no say in how these companies conduct their business. We have already disinvested from thermal coal and companies with bad practices and no signs of improvement. The Church of Scotland Investors Trust is a member of the Church Investors Group, a body that holds investments exceeding £17 billion. That is big enough for company managements to sit up and take notice. Voting and working together can make a difference, and one of the trustees of our Investors Trust is a member of the steering group of that group. They push for companies to align with the Paris Climate Agreement, along with other concerns such as modern slavery and water stewardship. At Shell's annual general meeting yesterday, we've heard about the 5% vote, but there was also a 25% vote of shareholders voting against the firm's remuneration report, and that was in protest against their performance on sustainable development targets. And the Church Investors Group was part of that. It would be good to stay in that fight. The Investors Trust reports to the Assembly on Thursday afternoon. Encourage them to play their full part in the Church Investors Group, which is a great example of ecumenical working where we are truly more powerful together. So I ask Commissioners to reject the counter-motion and decide not to take the easy way out and just walk away from this issue. Thank you.
Stuart Fulton.
Moderator, I say forced is a wrong word, but I was urged along to a meeting on Monday night to do with climate change. And I don't know how I would have voted in this debate had I not gone. One figure stuck firmly in my mind, and I think it will be apposite to share it with you all. If all the reserves that are presently known are used by oil companies, our climate change difference will be 5 degrees. The Paris Agreement says that anything above 2 degrees will have catastrophic effects on our planet. It's not just about money. It's not just about what we're going to get as investors. And it's not just about being a focus group or a group within a group to complain. It's about doing the right thing. It's about being able to sleep at night. It's about being able to look our brothers and sisters all over the world in the face and say, we are with you and we know what you're going through and we want to help stop it. And saying post-fossil fuel is quite a scary thing, because post-fossil fuel in today's language means a 5-degree increase in the world's climate. I would support Jenny Adams with bells on, moderator.
Thank you. I have 8 speakers lined up to talk. Can I say to you, if you, I know people take time to prepare these things and they want to say what they have prepared, but if someone has already said what you want to say, could you find the courage not to say it? And those who do speak, can you keep it as concise as we possibly can? Otherwise, we may just need to stop hearing people, and that we don't want to do. Okay. So Terry Peterson, sorry.
Terry Peterson, 220. Moderator, I have a question about the pastoral care of our members who work in the industries from which we choose not to continue investing. I note with interest that we do not invest in tobacco, alcohol, or armaments. And I am curious then about the feelings of those I find in the pub at the end of working here each day, and whether we have any care in the world, frankly, about whether our church chooses to invest our pension funds in alcohol, though we clearly enjoy our time there, and our members work in distilleries and as bartenders. Our members are smokers. Our members are in the military and use all of those things. So I would just wonder how we balance our concern about our care for people who work in the oil and gas industry with our care for people who work in other industries in which we choose not to invest.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Michael Scott.
Michael Scott, 570. Moderator, I will be brief. I haven't had time to prepare. I'd like to say something because I retired in September after 30 years in the oil industry. The last 27 of those were offshore in the North Sea, which is where the environmental emissions occur. What I would say to you is that oil companies, they won't tell you, but most of them can do more to reduce their emissions, but it is expensive. So it will not be an easy admission from them, and they won't respond quickly to your approaches. But we have influence. We've heard it already. In a group, we have influence. The oil companies will listen, and I really do believe that we should use that influence and not step back from it, because that opens the floodgates for environmental emissions and things to go out of control. I worked for a company who had rigid targets on emissions, and they were rigidly applied. We were not allowed to go over our emissions, even to the extent that we would shut the platform down, because in a particular month we were going to exceed our target. Now that is a major step for oil companies to take. So oil companies will do it. But one thing I would say is that not all oil companies are out of step. Quite a number are within step on their emissions. So we need to be careful that we don't put something blanket in place for the oil industry. We need to be specific. Maybe not to name in our reports, but to actually find out who the culprits are and use that influence. The other thing I would say on the motions that we have to consider, 2 of them begin with urge, and I like the idea of instruct better than urge. But my feeling is that Mr. Bogle's submission is the best because it doesn't divest from the oil and gas industry. I think it's important that we use the influence we have.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Alan Sorensen.
Moderator Sorensen 222, thank you. I would like to speak in support of Albert Bogle. It seems to me it makes far more sense. Oil and gas companies don't make our cars. Oil and gas companies don't build our houses or our churches where we use the fossil fuels. Why do we make them the bogeymen? They are meeting a demand, they're supplying a demand which we create. And we're all well aware that in the church over centuries we used to castigate certain services, certain professions until we realised that the answer was to cut off the demand, not the supply. And I think that's the attitude that we have to take here. If we continue to engage with oil and gas companies, then we can do, as Albert said and as many others have said, we can talk to them, we can encourage them to diversify, to use their vast profits to become energy companies and to go into renewables rather than just oil and gas. We can talk to them, but if we disinvest, we lose our seat at the table, we lose our voice. Nobody, but nobody, believes that climate change is a good thing or should be denied. Every one of us is horrified at the way we are ravaging our planet. The oil and gas companies aren't the bogeymen. We all are, as Albert said, when we put our petrol or our diesel into our car, if we heat our churches or our houses with gas. So I would urge everybody to support Albert. And this little debate that's come up at the end about urge or instruct crystallises exactly what he is suggesting. We can't instruct our investors. We urge them. We can't instruct oil and gas companies. But if we stay invested, we can urge them.
Thank you. John Carswell.
Carswell 317. I'd like to talk about pensions, if I could, please, moderator.
Briefly.
Yes.
Thank you.
No, I was reading the pension report this morning and noticed that our minister's scheme is 106% funded. The minister's widows and orphans is 103.
However, pensions will be reporting at a
Yes,
future date more specifically, and that might be more suited to firing in their direction.
It's not irrelevant. I think at least part of our surplus is a result of our investments. So we need to be careful about the understanding that it has a direct impact on our money, and are we prepared to come to those terms? So I'd like to speak in favor of Mr. Bogle's amendment, or because when we leave the table, we can't participate in the conversation. So,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Tara Shannon, and this list seems to be growing. The idea was to try and finish it. And if, as I say, someone has already said what you intend to say, please don't say it, because we can then get on to hear the voice of the Assembly as a whole in relation to the counter motions and the motion. Tara Shannon.
Tara Shannon, 823. As a young person in the Church of Scotland, I'm concerned about God's creation and the people of him. I understand that something needs to be done, and myself, along with others, have been passionate about this for many years. In 2007, around 3/4 of Scotland's energy was produced by renewables. If we divest from fossil fuels, we can put that money into investing in renewables and retrain those people who are in the oil and gas industry. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara. Kenneth Mackenzie.
Moderator, Kenneth Mackenzie, 563. I have the privilege of living in Upper Deeside in the Cairngorm Mountains in the western part of Aberdeenshire. And for us, this debate strikes very close to home. We, in our parish and the neighbouring parishes on the Dee, know very well the effects of climate change. And I can't hear anybody here saying that climate change is not an issue. We had 400 properties flooded in the late part of 2015. Our organist was out of his home with his wife for 17 months. It has been we know that the rain came, It was not because of it being winter time and snow, it was because there was no snow. It was a lot of rain came for several months when there should have been snow, and it came as rain, and it was just a disaster for us. But we're involved in all sorts of things. We're right into renewable energy. Braemar has got its own hydro scheme, very well funded by the local community. We get some benefits back from that. We want to see more of that. But we are conflicted somewhat because we live in a remote area, and really we have to use, at the moment, we have to be using carbon-emitting fuels. We would wish it otherwise, but that is the case. And we also are conflicted because we have people in our community whose lives and livelihoods are directly tied up with the oil and gas industry. And that brings me to this question of what will it say to the oil companies if we withdraw our funds? The oil companies already know what we feel. What will it say? My suggestion is it's not going to say very much. Or what will it do? It will have not so very much effect. What it will do, my concern would be that we have people who live in our community that are involved in churches and parishes, some of them people who just see it as a job. But some of them who are movers and shakers in the industry are people who we engage with day by day and who listen, are interested in this kind of debate. My concern is that should we go down the road as been suggested, that we would end up not having a voice, not at the table, that's one thing, but that we would not have a voice in our own communities with those who do make decisions and have the opportunity to influence decisions that are made at board level. I would therefore support Albert Bogle's motion.
Thank you. Yvonne Grant.
Moderator, I haven't put my card in.
Oh, well, that was a quick one. Terry Taylor. That's it.
Terry Taylor, 327. I too would like to speak in support of Albert Bogle's amendment or motion or whatever you call it. I'm not very good with General Assembly language.
Don't worry.
But while Albert was speaking, I was reminded of something that I read in a book by Tony Campolo a good number of years ago, and I hope it was an appropriate use of the internet to find that piece. And I won't read it all, but it was about a small group of people making a difference. And it was an assessment that was set to some sociology students from a college in the USA, an assignment in which they were asked how a small group of Christians could bring about significant social change. And they focused upon the practices of the Gulf and Western Corporation in the impoverished country of Haiti. And their proposal was so audacious that one of the students said, "Why don't we do it?" And they did. And they bought shares in the company, and they went and they voted and they spoke, and there were changes in Haiti. They had a voice because they had shares. And if we have a voice, I don't think we should lose it, because every one of us is concerned about climate change. I think about these Ziploc bags and how enamoured I was with them, and now I look at them and think, I don't really want to use them because I'm going to have to bin them. So keep our voice.
Yvonne, your ticket seems to be in. Oh, right, okay.
No,
it's now gone.
Here.
Yes, thank you. Donald Muir.
Donald Muir, 553. Moderator, what's been said is already has covered what I was wanting to say, but one reflection I've got on, in support of Reverend Bogle's submission, is that I feel very privileged to be here as a first-time convener, and I've actually got a voice here. I can influence, and I can influence because I am here. I'm in the body of the General Assembly. If we completely divest from the companies that we want to try and influence, we have no voice. If we remain, albeit a very much a minority investor, we retain that voice within their shareholders' meetings. Thank you.
Thank you. I have 3 names left, Mr John Lang, Mr John McCaverty and Mr William McPherson. Are you content to hear these 3 and then to ask those proposing? Thank you. So, John Lang.
Moderator, I'm
Your name and number first, thanks.
John Lang, 500.
Thank you.
Moderator, if we sell our shares, they're very likely to be taken up by banks, insurance companies and investment companies, the very people who back our pensions, wherever they come from. These companies are not ethical. They do not care about the environment. I know, moderator, I worked for one for 39 years.
Thank you.
I suggest we keep our shares, we take a voice to their annual general meetings, and let it be a voice crying in the wilderness that some of these companies are creating. Thank you,
Thank you.
moderator.
John McCafferty.
Moderator, just a quick point on the discussions about pensions. In the last 5 or 6 years with the disinvestments, okay, my name.
You did, indeed. You said John McCafferty, 568.
Thank you very much. Anyway, the point of the thing is that there are something like 95% of the investments of the pension trustees are index-linked gilts to match the liabilities, and there are almost no equities at all. And that some of these equities, where we hold them directly, are not in any of these companies we're talking about. And the little bit, perhaps in a unit trust, might have some, but we've got no control over that. So any comments about the pension trustees is really quite irrelevant.
Okay. William McPherson.
Moderator, I have to declare an interest here.
Name and number. Yeah.
Sorry, McPherson, 505. I have to declare an interest. My family and I were fed and clothed largely by the oil industry over many years. But I'd like to talk in support of Albert Bogle's counter motion. We are obviously all agreed that climate change is a bad thing. But how about the National Health Service? They use plastic disposable syringes. Many plastics, sorry, I voted today, many plastics have actually very useful uses for society as a whole. If we throw out petrochemicals, we throw out plastics. Let us actually support Albert Bogle's motion to point the oil and gas industry towards a beneficial use of the resources for mankind. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Are we at a point where we want to hear those who propose the counter motions speaking? Yes. Thank you. Can I ask Albert to close?
Can I just say, firstly, that I want you to realise if you vote for this motion, you're not voting against all that the Council stands for, because I'm standing with them together on this. I agree with this. We need to change. We need change. So what we're voting against is the way you do it, how you bring about change. And what I'm suggesting is that we not urge someone else to do something and urge someone else to do something that they can't do anything about because it's an urge, but we instruct our council who are here to do something about it and to talk and to begin with engagement, because we can accomplish great things by engagement, by talking to people, by journeying with them. And we have got some amazing people around that table who could do that. And I know Richard Fraser is excellent at that kind of thing. So we're not short of people who can begin to do this. So this is not against what we're standing for. This is picking up on this whole idea of what we can do. We can instruct and make a difference. Now, if I can remember the next wee bit I had here, I don't normally do these kind of things. I normally have it all in my head. I'm always glad I can remember my mother's dividend number. So we're talking about how we achieve our ends. Divestment from the corporation or the companies by the trustees, and is in some ways, you probably heard people saying, it's an easy thing for us to say, you do that, and we can walk out feeling we've made something. But the reality is, I have got to tie that in with my conscience. Am I willing to divest myself with austerity in my own life? And now I know some people are doing it, and therefore I applaud them. I applaud them with all my heart. But not everybody's doing it. And not everyone's maybe reached that point. So if I drive a car, I'm using up resources. So I've got to think about that. Is there another way we can begin to change things? The point also is that we have many people who are involved in the oil industry who need to be supported and encouraged to keep an ethical viewpoint alive. And that's not just in the boards, because quite rightly, Sally has said that you can de-invest and still have an influence. But the bigger picture is to have the influence on the people round about us in our everyday lives. And if people hear that the church has nothing to do with the oil industry and not investing, then what does that say to the movers and shakers who are in some parishes who are seeking to live out an ethical way and seeking to find and be an influencer in their industry? And finally, I want to go back to this idea of engaging. You can actually make a difference by engaging with people, by going and finding people, eyeballing them. And I know that because I've done it all my life. People of influence make a point of seeing them, eyeball them, speak to them, begin to challenge them. And it's individuals that change companies. It's individuals that can make a difference, building relationships with people to make a difference. And therefore, I think this is an easy one to divest. But by no means am I undermining or seeking to undermine the intentions of the people who bring this, because they're good intentions. But what I'm thinking is, I think my way is just a smarter way. Thank you.
Jennifer Adams.
Jenny Adams, number 600. Possibly not quite so smart. It's great to hear a General Assembly concurring that climate change is an enormous and urgent problem for the world, as experienced already by so many of our sisters and brothers. And yes, there is then a disagreement about how we play our part and and help make the transition, the essential and urgent transition that is needed. By 2020, it is felt that global climate, to meet the Paris Agreement, to avoid no more than 1.5 degrees of temperature rise, global climate emissions need to peak by 2020. And they rose last year, and we're still rising. We're not going in the right direction. There's been a huge discussion about whether divestment loses us a voice at the table, and it does not necessarily do so. The Church of Scotland, the Investors' Trust, are still part of the Church Investors Group and will continue to be part of that group. And we have just agreed in previous sections of deliverance that the Church will work more towards faith-consistent investment and policies for the future. We still have that voice, and by showing that we intend to act 2 years on from when we said we would engage for 2 years, it gives teeth to our engagement to say, and it gives teeth to our sisters and brothers who are still part of those engagements and part of the table, sitting round that table, to say, well, we said we would talk about this for 2 years. 2 years is up, and we're not seeing a change. So now we're actually going to act on it. We're not just going to carry on. So we do still have a voice, and this also strengthens other people's voice as part of that movement. And other churches have already taken this step. The URC Synod in Scotland has withdrawn its investment from oil and gas industry, while their sisters and brothers in England have continued to engage. But that gives a collective voice. I share the concerns for those who work in the oil and gas industry, because many of them live in my parish. I have lived in Murray most of my life, and it's a huge part of the economy. But it's already crumbling. Murray is also, I might mention, whisky country. And for many decades, this church has not invested in the whisky industry, and I don't think engagement in the whisky industry requires us to reinvest in that. Engagement in the whisky industry comes in the everyday encounters we have with those who live and work around us, just as it does with those who live and work around us who work in the oil and gas industry. And we certainly need to recognise their needs in a very difficult time. And the question was asked about the inconsistency if we disinvest from oil and gas while still heating our churches with oil. And I would suggest the General Trustees report includes a mention of the new energy supply contracts, and perhaps there may be a question for them this afternoon about that. But how we heat our churches, how we travel, how I travel around a parish should probably involve a car much less than it does. And so it's not a one-off, it's not an either-or, we disinvest or we change our lifestyles. We need to do both, and we need to do those just as urgently. It affects a challenge to all of us. And so what do people hear when we stand and talk about this? I hope they hear that it is difficult, that it's not easy potentially financially, though I don't think actually the financial future of the oil industry is great. But it also says we are willing to stand and be inconvenienced and face the austerity and the challenge to our lifestyles and our comfort in our churches or our homes or whatever else it needs, to stand with others, to be part of this bigger movement and say, we're going to use our voice this way and give strength to all those who are calling for this change right now. Thank you.
Convener.
Thank you, Moderator. I think fossil fuels use is a wee bit like an addiction. And for those who've had the experience of living with addiction, it's a tough thing to wean yourself off it. But we've been addicted to fossil fuels for many, many years now. But what most of us have known is that we're living through what has been described as the petroleum interval. And it is an interval in human history. We need to move on from it, as hard as that can be. One of the things that has been mentioned in this discussion, and it's been a really valuable discussion, a really courteous and helpful discussion, and I'm so grateful for it, is that there's a sense in which by walking away from investment in fossil fuels, we in some sense demonize people who are in that industry. Well, one of the things I would say is that one of the meetings that we had was with Gordon Craig, who is the oil chaplain based in Aberdeen. He has come into the oil industry from being an armed services chaplain. And we spoke, and he spoke very movingly about the way in which in 2003, when many of us marched against our intervention in Iraq, we were full square behind the men and women of our armed forces. You can disagree with a policy without necessarily demonizing the people that have to implement it. We agree, and our report says that engagement is a valuable tool. And through the course of this last 2 years, we have learned, I've certainly learned, a huge amount about the value of engagement. But we also recognize, as has been said, that you don't necessarily have to be invested in something in order to engage. I think what's also really important to bear in mind is that just as we are concerned pastorally for those human beings involved in the oil industry, aware of the cost that has been in human lives in that industry, we also need to recognize the humanity of those in our world, our brothers and sisters in other parts of the world who are suffering now, and it is often the poorest who suffer the most. We took a direction of travel with this. We tried to keep everyone on board. And I think we've succeeded up to this point. And this is the point where I think the General Assembly needs to come to a mind about this. And we have some options. But all I would say in conclusion is that we should not write a blank check. Albert Bogle's motion suggests that we engage. One of the things that we talked about a great deal was the way in which we would engage, but we would have some benchmarks, some milestones to reach in the process that we were undertaking. His motion would suggest that we simply just talk. And I think if we're really serious about climate change, we also have to act, and we have to pass milestones and act on these milestones. So it's now for the General Assembly to make a decision. Thank you for this debate. It's been incredibly helpful.
Thank you. We move now to an electronic vote.
Moderator, the voting options are now on the screen. The voting will open when I announce that it is open. At that point, the clock will start. There will be 60 seconds in which commissioners may cast their vote. But remember, voting only begins when the clock starts. If you press the button before, you need to press it again. If you change your mind halfway through, it only records your final pressing of the button. That's not very good English. Anyway, I think it's nearly lunchtime. So we've got, if you press button 1, if you are for the motion in the print, so section 6 in the print of the Blue Book. You press button 2 for the counter motion in the name of Jenny Adams, and you press button 3 for the counter motion in the name of Albert Bogle. Do we all happy? The voting is now open. There are 10 seconds remaining. The voting is closed.
For the motion, 128. For counter motion number 2, or button number 2, 135. For counter motion on button number 3, 300. Counter motion 3 carries in the name of Mr. Bogle. Thank you. We move on to deliverance 7.